Okay, we'll proceed. Welcome back after lunch. I hope everybody's had a nice break, got some lunch and are ready for the next section. So we have 3 speakers now between now and our next coffee break. The first one I'm delighted to announce is an archivist. It's one of my own team at the Military Archives, Lisa Dolan. Lisa Dolan is Head of Reader Services, Education and Outreach and has worked at the Military Archives since 2008. She has a BA in Classics from UCD and a Master's in Archives and Records Management from UCD. Lisa's main responsibilities focus on the Military Archives' interactions with the public and has also a special responsibility for managing the volunteers that kindly give up their time to help us catalogue and list our records. I'm very happy to say that Lisa is going to be presenting to you now on some new work she's involved with at the Military Archives in her presentation documenting the National Army Dead. Lisa.
I'm just going to move a bit here. Okay, well, good afternoon to you all, and thank you for the warm welcome, Dan. Before I start, I would like to say thank you to the conference organisers in the Military History Society, Dr. Pat McCarthy, and in the Military Archives, Commandant Daniel Iotis and Lieutenant Richard Wan, for giving Tony and I an opportunity to share details about our timely project with conference participants. It's a project that has occupied our time and thoughts over a number of years. This afternoon's presentation has been designed to get across our motivation in establishing the project in late 2019, its scope and the sources we used. And Tony Kinsella has kindly given me the floor to talk about our work. It is a work in progress, but nearing an end point, so I can talk with a degree of confidence about the project output, which I feel is a point of most interest to audience members. I am assuming many in this audience are familiar with the Military Archives and our collections, given your interest in attending this conference. You may also have used our research services either in person or by sending us an email query and may be frequent visitors to militaryarchives.ie. You may also be aware that the Military Archives has played a significant role both in public and within the organisation to promote the widest possible access to key revolutionary period collections, in line with the nation's commemoration of the 1916 Rising, the War of Independence, and presently the 100-year anniversary of the Civil War. The provision of public access to the collections we hold and the provision of accurate information and content to colleagues within the organisation and researchers is a large part of what we do. For many years, members of the public have contacted us, typically by email, to find out about their relatives' connections to the revolutionary period and elements of their military service. Collections such as the Military Service Pensions Collection, the Irish Army Census 1922, and military service records are frequently accessed to illuminate this area of research and to offer those that make such queries concrete information using what we feel are trusted records. Access on account of cataloguing, digitisation and online presentation has eased the process considerably, both for online users and staff dealing with such queries. I speak about the research part of the work carried out by archivists because it is one of the reasons why this project was initiated. Queries that request the particulars on the death of a soldier in service, whether the death occurred on United Nations service or fighting during the revolutionary period, reach our inbox on a frequent basis. Queries such as these may come from direct descendants, local historians, or military historians. The challenge to ably deal with these queries is finding records that can be trusted, and expediently so, given the demands on our service. In terms of Revolutionary War dead, before the advent of the Military Service Pensions Collection, staff relied on a number of sources, such as military service records, a roll of deceased personnel that was developed by the Enlisted Personnel section. You can see an example of the front cover there. And in the case of Republican War Dead, a publication titled The Last Post, I actually just read online that it's worth a fortune now, the hardback version, so I'll be putting that in our glass case from now on. So additional information on burial, funeral expenses and the welfare of dependents could also be gleaned from Army Finance Office files and Department of Defence A files. So that's just an example there of a cover of an A file, which contains letters from relatives of two men that were buried in the national plot, the Glasnevin plot, looking to put small markers on the plot itself. And a decision was made that they could indeed do so because they weren't going to be permanent markers, but the expenses would have to be borne by themselves. So it was clear that we could find information on, say, a soldier in the National Army that died in service during the Civil War, and we could bring it together, but only when a number of sources were consulted. So you can imagine how time-consuming something like that would be. The role of deceased personnel was often our first step to locate a service record, location and date of death. And when this role failed to deliver on a few occasions, we quickly realised that this role was by no means complete in terms of Civil War dead. As a consequence also of dealing with such queries, we also found that we were amassing information on National Army Civil War dead, and in some cases gathering photographs and memorial cards. And these would be from people that were applying for information on their relatives. But we had nowhere to record these cases, so they used to just kind of sit in the inbox. Veteran organisations such as IUNVA and the Defence Forces itself maintains a role of soldiers and officers that died in service with the United Nations, and yet there was no role that could be trusted in view of National Army Civil War deaths or updated as information came to us. And it seems crazy that we would see these as new cases, but I'll go into that later because a couple of names have come into us vis-a-vis family directly, and it's always been very interesting. So the United Nations role, for example, has been widely published in commemorative issues of the Army magazine on Cossentor, and often the names are read out in ceremonies. There are memorials to Irish UN deceased personnel and actual mission areas such as Tibneen Village in Lebanon and throughout Ireland, and irishwarmemorials.ie has a list of such sites. Knowing that there is a void in terms of a role of National Army war dead means that similar opportunities for commemoration have been lost over the years, resulting in a type of amnesia, both in the public sphere and organisational sphere. The ethics of commemoration and its place in the social consciousness has been examined in great depth, in particular in the lead up to 2016. Reading such works in detail on the subject only reinforced the importance of producing the role and addressing head-on what I perceive to be an ambivalence towards remembering this significant loss of life in service during the Civil War. This perception is not just my own, but one shared with me by members of the public that have made contact with us on the subject. All this rumination over the years raised the question of should a role be produced and how could it? The first question was easily answered. Absolutely, yes, it was needed. The second question required a little more thought. Could staff be freed up to tackle its production? Other considerations were its inclusivity, and once determining inclusion, how much detail should we record? We also needed to identify the records we could trust and easily access to support its production. I mentioned earlier that the Military Archives has played an important public role in the delivery of our services in the lead up to key anniversaries, and certainly the Defence Forces has played a key ceremonial role. It stood to reason that a time would come when a question was asked, possibly from within the organisation and my superiors, on how many National Army soldiers died during the Civil War. It was a question of interest, I felt, to local historians in their quest to establish county-wide numbers. In 2020, while Tony and I were considering the project and its parameters, experience had taught me that this question was likely to come, and come perhaps in 2022, perhaps in 2023, and shouldn't we, as the Military Archives, be prepared to answer it? Deciding on the parameters was pretty straightforward. We decided that soldiers attested in the National Army that died in service, irrespective of cause, would find a place on the roll. We could see from the enlisted personnel roll that deaths occurring in 1922 to 1924 were attributed to many causes: killed in action, accidental discharge of rifle, natural causes, mine explosions, and motor accidents. And we felt it was not up to us to make a distinction, categorise or exclude. Based on roles existing in other areas, such as the United Nations role, or indeed entries in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, our main consideration was accuracy in names, rank, date of death, and location of death and burial place. Cause of death would of course be recorded, as we could anticipate that future users may wish to categorise themselves based on their research interest. Our goal was completedness and accuracy, which is challenging given conflicting reports in media on such cases and on occasion within the same record. On close examination of particular cases, we could see that a number of deaths in 1923 and 1924 resulted from wounds received in action or illness attributable to service during the months of fighting, and we decided to include the names of those who died after the ceasefire order on the 24th of May 1923. The Army Pensions Act 1923 also recognised such cases in the award of allowances and gratuities to dependents of those who died from disease attributable to service in the period ended 30th of September 1924, and I'll talk later about how we relied on the military service pensions collection to populate the roll and expand information further. I spoke earlier about staffing this particular project, and anyone that knows the behind-the-scenes operation of the military archives knows that a number of archive volunteers generously give us their time and lend their skills in advancing our services. These relationships have built over time, and we all know what each other's interests are in terms of history. We also know how each other likes their tea and their coffee as well. Having worn Tony down over the years with projects he is unlikely to forget for all the wrong reasons, I felt that this endeavour might be the right fit, because the work demanded a close inspection of military service records. I knew Tony had an interest in this area given his work on the British Army in Ireland during the revolutionary period, which took him to the National Archives in Kew on many occasions. He was also often our go-to on British Army queries and pointing people in the right direction given his knowledge of online sources such as medal cards and regimental records. The idea of collaboration was also an important one. Not only did Tony and I collaborate on establishing the project and progressing its aims, we also relied on the support of others. Our colleagues in the military archives provided much needed support, sending on information on Civil War deaths as they came across such detail, whether through emails or in the course of their own work. I've just included an email from my colleague Hugh Beckett there just saying, there's somebody here, I don't think they're on the spreadsheet, and it gives us an opportunity then to look into it. The military service pensions project team provided guidance when it came to understanding the military service pensions collection files, notably the D series, and often consulted files on our behalf that might aid our work. Their work in creating a database that can be filtered to deliver such a focused return, such as the one we wanted, gave us so much valuable information for the role. Tony and I also consulted a publication that was like a companion to Tony and I over the course of the project. The Forgotten Fallen by James Langton lists National Army soldiers who died during the period June 1922 to May 1923, and it was published in 2019. As I mentioned earlier, completedness and accuracy is our end goal, and as a consequence, we are using Langton's volume to ensure that we have not forgotten any soldier. The project was in relative full swing by December 2019, with the spreadsheet created by Tony and populated with entries relating to deaths occurring between 1922 and 1924 extracted from the enlisted personnel roll. And I've just done a little snapshot there of the spreadsheet, which doesn't look very exciting. The next stage fell to me, and that was to locate service records connected to the men detailed on the spreadsheet at that point and provide access to Tony to examine these records and expand information further. So you can see an image of the spreadsheet, as I said, and also the first page of Private John Pender's service record. This stage also gave us an insight into what could be gleaned in terms of information about the casualty and the circumstances of his death. What was probably unexpected, however, was that attestation forms signed by the soldiers were held on many files, and these forms gave details of previous service. In a large number of cases, the service was in the IRA, and many soldiers at the time of attestation were in a position to identify the name of their company and battalion and estimate the length of their service. Post-death, information was also compiled if dependents engaged with Army authorities on the subject of funeral expenses, burial arrangements, and welfare. We realised that our spreadsheet needed to contain additional fields to allow capture of this information, and we made the required adjustments. Fortuitously, a large-scale digitisation project took place a number of years ago, which digitised from microfilm service records which had been microfilmed in the 1980s. The ability to create folders of digital records for Tony to read no doubt sped up the process considerably. And perhaps not overly clear is a small picture of the folder structure. So Tony would access, if he was looking into surnames beginning with P, he'd open up a P folder and the service records that I had found would be contained within that folder. Though lockdown disrupted elements of our work, it did not halt the project entirely, as there was a spreadsheet part populated to edit. We could do that from home, and we could also access the military service pensions collection online to continue our work. Once normal business resumed, and in order to identify cases not known to us and to allow investigation, we completed targeted searches of a database of personnel service records and also investigated cases which came to us by way of queries received by military archives directly. We also examined index cards and lists which came from other record offices, and we talked as well to officers and NCOs working in the Area Records Centre because they had so much familiarity with the records that they held there. In fact, a list likely produced during the Civil War and showing a return of casualties by command was unearthed by a colleague during a recent stock check, and a number of new cases were subsequently added to the spreadsheet. Anyone working on similar projects might understand the feeling that comes with such a discovery. Time does not allow me to go into too much detail about all the sources we used, and I intend to devote the remainder of time allowed to talk about our capture of military service records and the examination of same. I mentioned earlier how Tony and I were greatly impressed with the level of information contained in the service records. Considering the brevity of service in some cases and the chaotic times, most service records contain, at a minimum, an attestation form, medical report on enlistment, and details of date of death, cause of death, location of death, and confirmation of rank and service number. On occasion, service records also contain coroner's order for burial and correspondence between Army authorities and dependents. Telegrams sent to family informing them of the death are on a number of records also, alongside important burial information. So I've got an example there of an attestation form of Private William Newcomb, who died on the 6th of March 1923, and I've just kind of highlighted the part that he signed, and then that's also the physical description there. There's also an excerpt from a column from the Ontoglach, which was kind of Gaelic for the army, and it would pose in 3 columns: the Old Irish, the phonetic kind of spelling of it, and then also the English translation. And the description there of, going into the barracks and what happened at that point is fairly, it chimes very much with what we have found on service records and the type of documents that were created at the time of attestation. So we felt that, there is a reason why family historians with military connections and military historians seek access to military records, often going through a set process to do so. And it's a process that we adhere to ourselves, where records are available to direct next of kin. And I know it sometimes causes people to hit a brick wall. The records often provide firm answers to long-considered questions on death and service in particular, and we've witnessed firsthand how impactful these records are to direct descendants over the years, in some cases confirming burial place, and in some cases expanding on the circumstances of death. Our reason for consulting these records was for the production of the role, and our examination of the records prompted much discussion about certain cases, such was the level of detail held in many. Our position in regards to this project was undoubtedly a privileged one. The decade of commemorations, thanks to the Military Service Pensions Collection, has brought long overdue attention to many members of the IRA and Cumann and lone and joint acts of bravery. Personal sacrifice and hardship experienced in older age have also been highlighted, giving in some cases a near complete life cycle story. The records identified in the course of this project could be seen in a similar light, and it is the intention, when the project reaches an end, to make identified service records of the National Army Civil War dead available to the public. These will be the first set of Defence Forces military service records to be released online. Particular consideration was given to this record set, given the centenary, the age of the records, and the interest in this particular area of the Civil War. There is much opportunity to take a creative approach as to the presentation of the role and relevant records using militaryarchives.ie, One only needs to look at the fatalities timeline published in the Military Service Pensions Collection to see exactly what is possible. For now, it's a case of watch the space as Tony and I finalise what we both feel is important and meaningful work. I thank you for your kind attention this afternoon, and if anybody wants to have a chat over coffee when this session finishes, please feel free to come over to me. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Lisa. As anybody who's come to see me speak or read anything I've written about archives and that kind of thing, it's very important for me to have our profession as archivists represented at conferences like this, because sometimes I think in the public perception it can be a confluence between the profession of historian and the profession of archivist, but it is very much its own independent profession with a separate set of skills and methodologies and practice and things like that as well. So thanks for representing that for us, Lisa. A few of the team actually came in there at the back there to see you. I'm not sure who's running the archive, but they're here. Okay.